Okay, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, good evening, depending on where you're coming in from. Thank you for popping into our webinar. Let me just introduce the event, as well as myself and our speaker before we get started. So my name is Sixiang Wang. I teach Korean history here at UCLA. I'm in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, and today I'll be your host, I guess, for the first of our Games in Korean History webinar series. It's hosted by the UCLA Center for Korean Studies. The webinar series brings together game creators, history teachers, and scholars, and the gaming community through discussions over Korean history and its simulation. We view gaming, whether as classroom simulations, board games, or digital media, as a form of historiography in its own right. Rather than approach history and games merely as content, we want to consider the questions of position-taking, simulation, agency, and representation as powerful ways of engaging with the past. So a little bit about our hosts. The UCLA Center for Korean Studies was established in 1993 to coordinate the development of UCLA's versioning programs in Korean studies. It's one of the biggest Korean studies, it presides over one of the biggest Korean studies programs on the mainland of the United States. With the most specialists dedicated to Korea on its faculty and the largest number of students studying Korean subjects, both at the undergraduate and graduate levels. We're also supported by the Chosun History Society, which is a public learned society fostering the study, research, and teaching of Korea's past by connecting scholars working both outside and inside the professional academy. The Chosun History Society is a community based on sharing rather than competition or exclusivity, and looks to provide opportunities for scholars who are creating independently or otherwise under-resourced to share research and generate interest in their work. We're also sponsored by the UCLA's CMRS Center for Early Global Studies, which promotes and sustains transdisciplinary studies of the periods from the 3rd to the 17th century across the globe. The center's mission is grounded in the disciplinary study of early periods and worlds, late antique, medieval, Renaissance, and early modern. And so hopefully, and today with our discussion on simulating Korea in early modern diplomacy, on Eurocentrism, agency, and the early modern world in Europa Universalis IV, we're looking forward to having this conversation that intersects these different interests. So one second. With that, I'd like to introduce our speaker, who is Dr. Álvaro Sanz. He is has been the content design coordinator at Paradox Tinto, which is a part of Paradox Interactive, a video game company founded in Sweden in 1999, and it's best known for releasing historically themed strategy video games, especially the grand strategy games genre. And Paradox Tinto is one of Paradox Interactive's newest development studios, and it's based in Barcelona, Spain. Currently, Álvaro has been part of the team that manages the historical grand strategy game Europa Universalis IV, having been part of the development of the content packs Origins, focused on sub-Saharan Africa, Lions of the North, focused on Scandinavia and the Baltic region. And he has also, as you might guess from how I've introduced him, he has also developed an academic career as a scholar specializing in the Iberian Middle Ages. He completed his PhD at the University of Valladolid, Spain in 2020. His research topic being the royal towns and territorial administration in Castile and Leon, power and society in the reign of Alfonso X. During his PhD, he published widely 8 papers and presented his work at various conferences in Spain, Portugal, the UK, and visited the University of Cambridge as a visiting scholar, having also taught courses and seminars at the University of Valladolid. With that, I think I will hand the floor over to Dr. Sanz, who will lead us through what I anticipate to be an exciting conversation about games and history.
So first of all, thanks to Dr. Wang for the invitation to this webinar about video games and history, which you might know that are my two most important interests right now. as both a historian and video game developer. So I will want to start saving the presentation as per. Hopefully you can see it and watch it. So today I want to talk a bit about how do we tackle history in our video games in Paradox Interactive and Paradox Tinto Studio, and more specifically on Europa Universalis IV. Basically, because Paradox Interactive is a Swedish video game company which has been created video games for over than 20 years, and its core business of video games is based on this grand strategy game genre. So history is at the core of the company and the video games we make. So it's very important for us. Some of the titles that have been published by Paradox in the last 20 years are related to the ancient age, as Europa Universalis Rome and Imperator Rome, Crusader Kings for Middle Ages, Europa Universalis for Modern Age, Victoria for the Victorian Age, Hearts of Iron for the World War II, and we even have a space fantasy GSE. So the range of interest of different periods of history in the company is wide. It's more than 2,000 years of history that we are covering with our video games. So yeah, more specifically on Europa Universalis, it's a saga of 4 video games that was started on 2001 with Europa Universalis 1, and the last iteration of the game is Europa Universalis 4, a game that was released on 2013. So it's almost 10 years old. This year is the 10th anniversary of the game, and the game is still alive, which is quite an outlier of a video game of this type. And this is an outlier on the company because it's the longest developed game on the company. So this studio, Paradox Tinto, which I belong to as content design coordinator, we are in charge of the video game since 2020 when the studio was founded in Barcelona, near Barcelona in Spain. So let's move on to the game itself. This is screen, but maybe you can see the game itself, which is what I have prepared. So I think it will be easier for everybody to check this. So basically, Europa Universalis is a game that portrays modern age between years 1444 and year 1820. The game is universalist in the sense that the player can play with any country in the world. So we are covering from the nation states of Europe, which are more or less the core of the game. We'll talk about this more about this later. To the Middle East, the different states of India. Then here we've got the China, Korea, Japan, which starts the game divided among the different daimyos. But we are also covering Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Oceania, Indonesia, the Americas, with the different tribes that we can find. So the scope of the game is truly universalist in the sense that we are covering the entire world. So let's focus a bit on the East Asia region. So and specifically on Korea, which is the main topic of this webinar, but not the only one. So here what we thought for a player that starts a game with a country like Korea, we want to give the player a historical immersion into the period and the history of that country. Obviously, there is a gameplay around that, which is what makes the game interesting for the player, and which has made people play for this game for 10 years. But we want to be careful, and we are careful about giving the historical background to the player, because the historical simulation, it's a core of the game. It's what keep our players playing for years with the same country or different countries, and encountering different situations and mechanics. So as you can see, this detail we try to put into the historical situation of the game. It starts with this screen where the situation of the Joseon Kingdom of Korea is described in 1444. So we have references to the 14th century and the transition from the old Goryeo kingdom to the Joseon dynasty running in Korea. We describe what is the situation, the relationship with China, in this case with the Ming dynasty. We describe Confucianism as the main religion. And more specifically, we have here descriptions about neighbors like the Jurchen tribes to the north, and different features of the game that are interesting for the player. So this is a first step into the simulation. So what does the player encounter? The player encounter that he plays as a ruler of a nation, and he controls the country, in the sense he controls the economy, he controls the diplomacy, he controls warfare, but he also controls the society of the country. So there are a lot of different levels in which the player gets into this historical situation. And apart from the core gameplay mechanics, like you've got armies, so you move them, you war with them, which is part of the core gameplay mechanics of the game, we have what we call flavor, which is this historical background that not only makes for an interesting gameplay, but we try to create narratives in the game. So the player knows what is the situation of the country and what is its main institutions, what are the main cultures, the main religion. So a lot of the historical features of that country we try to cover. So for instance, one of the features are the national ideas, which more or less are the soul of a country. So in that regard, it portrays its society, its institutions. So in the case of Korea, we have all the countries have traditions. They have also ambitions, which the player can unlock after the player progresses. And in this case, the national ideas is something that the player unlocks through the game. And these are the kind of institutions that he can find. Maybe it can be read better this way. So we try to portray in this case, and this is something a bit new because we have reworked the Korean ideas for the next update of the game. So we have institutions as the Woo. Sorry for my Korean, I'm not used to that. But we also have metal movable types, gunpowder engines, Korean artisanry, the Yang's Jack system, something which is quite popular, which is the Gyeobuksyeon ships, popular in pop history, I have to say. But yeah, this is a feature that also our players also request things that they think that are interesting for them, and this is something that we like to cover, and we try to explain the players which is the historical context of this type of features. So national ideas, we portray these institutions of the country. What else do we have? We have here, you're going to read it here better. This is something that we have created because as the game is live, we try to create new content. So Korea in 2013 in this game was very different to Korea in 2022 because we have gone on in more and more detail over years to offer new content for the players. And in this case, this is something new that we are creating for the next update. It's a government reform. So government reforms are basically how the player shapes the government of its country, and the player has a variety of different reforms to pick and play with. And in this case, the very first tier of government reforms are the power structure ones, which determines the general shape of the government of the country. In this case, for Korea, we have created this one, the Hermit Kingdom, which usually they give some kind of bonuses to the player. And what is more important for us, we try to link them to government or to game mechanics. In this case, we have created a new set of government mechanics for Korea. This is some kind of premiere because we are actually presenting this next Tuesday to our gaming community. So it's fine to present it here because it's 4 days before. So let me show you in game. Well, it's not actually going to work very well because this is what we call hot code. So as it's in development, not always works as we want. So basically what we put here is in government, this mechanic. So the player unlocks with this government reform a new game mechanic, which we have called perfectionism. This is because we work over the work of previous members of the design team. So there was something that was called inwards perfection for Korea, which let me put it this way. Korea is a tough nut to crack in the gameplay of this game because it was very stable from the historical perspective compared to other countries. We have the Joseon dynasty that rules the country from the 15th to the 19th century, if I recall correctly. So Korea, their situation in history, they had this type of relation with the Emperor of China, first the Ming dynasty, later the Qing dynasty. They had this border with the Jurchen tribes to the north, and there were these Manchu invasions later in the period. We obviously know that the most important feature of the period probably was the invasion that Toyotomi Hideyoshi made late 16th century, and the resistance of the Koreans against it. But there was, let's say, there was not much apart from those invasions. The borders of the country were more or less stable. The government of the country obviously evolved over 400 years, but it was not like, let's say, China or Japan, which had very deep changes in this period. Europe itself consolidated from the late Middle Ages into the 19th century in a very different way. And Korea was kind of a stable country compared to others. So this is a challenge because you want to offer an interesting experience to the player. And in this case, it's really different because you've got to build it upon internal factors mostly. So In this case, there was a mechanic which was called inwards perfection. So it basically fits with this historical problem of Korea being a kind of a stable kingdom. So we have developed it a bit, and let me show in how it should work. Not in my game version, but on another game developer version, a coworker. So we have created this mechanic, which allows the player to pick. You have to decide if upon 20 years or per ruler, but it will allow the player to pick between 3 focuses for the country. So these 3 focuses are inward focus, outward focus, and expansion focus. So let me explain a bit. The inward focus will make the player and the country to focus more on buildings, developing its country. So what we call in gameplay terms playing tall. So you do not play to expand your borders, you play to expand your economy, to expand your society. The second one, which is the outward focus, it's mostly based around trade, but also about colonization, because obviously Korea was not a colonizing power in real history, but in the game we give that possibility to the player. So it's up to the player to follow or not a historical path. So in this case, you can unlock national other ideas, and you can unlock exploration and expansion ideas, which will mean that a player playing Korea could go and discover, let's say, Australia. Well, discover, this is a term to be debated, because obviously there were people already living there. So, but you know, we have to use usually this kind of terms, this type of terms that are widely recognized by a common public, even if they are debatable or more debatable from in an academic space. So you can continue this. You can also explore all the way to the Americas, and the player could start colonizing the Americas. So this is alternative history, and we allow the player to do this. So in this case, going back to the mechanics, we will reinforce the player if the player wants to go this way. And the third one is the expansion focus. So this is something that the player will go on conquest. So again, very different from history. So let's say a player playing Korea could perfectly go or try to conquer Japan. So reversing history in some kind. So what else do we have? We have also created content portraying this type of historical flavor, which, as I said, our players appreciate a lot. So we have portrayed this Tripitaka Koreana, the Buddhist texts. So in this province, Jinju, because I have not said, but we have a type of map which is divided upon provinces. So we also try to portray the different regions, provinces in the better possible way. So we will get this in the province of Jinju. We are also portraying other institutions as institutions. One could name it institutions, but the Hangul alphabet, which is specific to Korea. So we have it in the game, and it gives, for instance, it gives the player reduced technology cost. So one of the features of the game is that players can research technologies, and this is giving a bonus to the player. We are also portraying the OPI system, which at some cost for the state, which is portrayed with this diplomatic and administrative power, the player spends that resources and it expands the country administration to get these rewards. So this is a bit how we, this is the gameplay effect. So obviously this is the core, but the interesting thing is that we try to portray the actual institutions of the country. So making both interesting. What else? We are also portraying other institutions that like the Righteous Army, which was so important in the Japanese invasion. So again, with agency to a player, I want to spend like 1 or 2 minutes on this because one thing that we also try to portray with these things, with these features, is portraying the historical processes. So we try to think, okay, what could be the triggers, that's the name we put, that could make the situation of making the Righteous Army available to a player. So in this case, it obviously has to be at war. It has to be a defensive war, so not an offensive one. The player or the country needs to have a high legitimacy, which is one of the currencies that we use in the game. And it obviously portrays how legitimate is the government of the country. And it's a feature of Korea. And it has also this kind of effects. So we try to think historically on, okay, we have this historical situation, so what led to this situation and what was the outcome and the effects of the situation. So we try to mix, in this case, history and gameplay, which I think it's one of the things that make our games interesting for players. So here we got, we used to have this historical text, which also gives this flavor to the player, this information about the historical situation. So obviously we cannot be as detailed as any type of historical source, as an academic source, even as Wikipedia. But this is, for a lot of our players, this is a starting point to get to know more history or better. And we encourage, I think that we encourage the players to, let's say, go and read books about the Japanese invasion, about the Joseon dynasty, or I mean, even reading the Wikipedia entry, it's interesting for historical knowledge, I think. This is also another type of feature we have, because obviously the Geobookseon, as I said, it's something that kind of is in pop history for some years, and we are implementing that also, but we try to be historical. So we also are portraying the Panoxion, which will be more the type of worship, the more usual type of worship that was used in Korea. So we researched that, and we had this type of discussion like, oh, the Geobookseon are cool and whatever, but we also want to portray historical accuracy. So we went with both in this case. So we are portraying different types of historical features. So just I want to finish my more or less 20 minutes presentation saying that as key points, I think, is that we are video game developers, but we usually love history in this company, and our video games are made up of or live in history, on real history, but also on alternative history, the what ifs. And this is something that the reason why someone asked me, which I'm a doctor in history, I'm working currently in the company, and there are other people working that had also a background as historians by their university degrees and such. So this is why here we work in a place which values this, and we try to make the most for also expanding this love of history to the players. And I think that, as I said before, that this makes our games successful. So thanks, and I think that we can continue with the webinar after this presentation.
All right. So, well, I think what we agreed on is, you know, I have some questions for Dr. Sanz following up the presentation. Oh, but before I get to that, we should I just want to, you know, thank you for the presentation. The audience can't actually clap for you because they're behind the webinar wall. But I think what we'll do now is, you know, I have some questions for you. And I think our audience does as well. So if you're an audience member, what I will suggest is, as the questions come up, feel free to use the Q&A system, and you can type in your question there, and then we'll take them as we go, I think. But while you're thinking about your questions, I'm just gonna pose one, right? And this is having to do with this issue of historical research, and you know, as someone who has delved quite a bit into this game in particular, and having had maybe put in more hours than I'm willing to admit in public, one thing I always found remarkable was just how much, you know, how much the game has evolved over the years, right? As you mentioned, 2013, things look very different from what they do now. And also the depth and detail of the historical world it tries to recreate. So I guess, you know, maybe not just the Korean case, but just in general, you know, can you tell us a little bit more about how developers like yourself conduct research for these kinds of for historical simulations? You know, what does the process look like?
Yes. So the process, we don't have rules in the process, so it depends a lot on the situation and what we want to work on. But generally speaking, we aim, let's say, for developing a new expansion or on the game. So we are working on a certain region or a certain set of mechanics. So we start researching about that. From where does come our inspiration? So first of all, sorry, I'm repeating a bit sometimes, but there is a lot of passionate people for history, about history in the team. So the first thing is that we like to create content about what we like to read about and research about. So that obviously makes the things easier. Obviously, you are not going to have passion for everything, but this is key, I think. Another starting point is our player community, because we have thousands, not hundreds of thousands of players. We have a very active community in social media, in our company forums. So they are usually asking us for about adding more historical content. And you can see people that their hobby are our games and that their hobby is history. So they do their own research and point out, I would like to have this, I would like to have that. And they even give us sources. Today I was gathering feedback from the forums, and one person linked a 1935 book on the Portuguese industry of salt. So this is the type of passionate community that also helps us to develop the history of games. Now going into more technical, as a former historian, the first source we go to is Wikipedia. And I think it's a good source because it gives the reader a wide vision of what's going on this country or this period or this institution. And obviously, the quality of the different Wikipedia pages is different, but the good ones, we also have these bibliographic sources at the end. So a lot of times we can go down after reading the page, go to the direct sources and extract more information from there. And obviously the last one, we have some academic sources. So let's say we have a lot of Cambridge history books about different regions or something like that, those type of sources. We are trying to create a historical database also on the studio and the company. So this is the more detailed one, and we go the last ones, to be honest. And it depends a bit of time because development time in video game is not the same as academia. So we try to be fast, but we also try to be accurate with building upon all these different factors.
Yeah, I think we actually have a question from the audience. I don't want to hog up all the space, and I think it does get to one of our concerns, right? And then this is a question from Ethan Pelland, who asks, how does Paradox decide the theme of the ideas to include? I've always found fascinating how the simple idea sets are able to give such a strong narrative identity to each country. How does the company balance between the fun value of countries versus game balance versus historical accuracy?
So there is not only one recipe or one rule. Sometimes of the three variables that have been mentioned, sometimes we, or most of the times we start with gameplay. So like, okay, we have a shopping list, what we want to cover. We want to cover something probably military, some diplomacy, some about the development of the country, maybe something about the society. Depending on the country, we will put more emphasis on some of the topics over the others. So some of the countries will have a high, big focus, let's say, on trade because they were trading nations. On other countries, we will focus more on, let's say, production or the land taxes. So, for instance, this kind of historical knowledge creates this narrative. France, let's say, was a country more agrarian, so the economical base was more based on farming, taxation, and such, while England, Britain had a bigger share on trading activities. So we have here, because of history, we try to focus on these narratives. Obviously, we also have to take into account the game balance. And about the historicity, we also like to point out specific topics. So sometimes it's the opposite. We have this very interesting institution or situation of this country. So we write first that situation, and then we see, okay, which values, which modifiers makes for this, will work with this. So it's a mix of all of this that at the end allows us to create these narratives, different narratives for the different countries.
So I guess a follow-up to this, and I think this is sort of, you touched on this in the presentation itself, and this is the question of the balance of giving the player adequate freedom while modeling a sense of historicity, so that we're not just doing things in a fantasy vacuum, but that their actions have some sort of relationship to history as such, right? And I think, as you mentioned, it's that connection to historicity that makes the game entertaining, right? And at least that's why the fan base returns. But I'm wondering, how or what are there certain parameters or guidelines or philosophies when it comes to sort of agency? And I know, as a historian, this is actually also a historiographical question, right? What is agency in history? What's contingent? What's the teleological endpoint of the game of history, right? These are things that historians have been debating all the time, and I wonder to what degree these things come into play when you are thinking about the game's design.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, which, to be honest, we questioned ourselves constantly. Because let's say from a gameplay perspective, we differentiate very clearly on what we call railroading of history and what we call sandboxing. So if you go as a game developer very much on railroading, yes, you are going to have a very historical product, but you are subtracting agenda to the player. And the opposite, if you go to a very sandboxy approach, okay, the player is going to have much more freedom, but probably, let's say 50 years after the start of the game, is going to say, okay, this is not history, this does not feel as the 1500s. So this is a challenge for us. It also depends a bit, let's say, on the country, on the content, because some countries we know that they start on 1444 on a certain situation, and they end up in 1820. They have evolved, but they are still there. But we also have what we call the historical losers. So we know that there was a lot of interstate conflict, and there was a lot of state consolidation, which meant some countries, some nations being annexed by others. And some of them are these kind of historical losers. We try to portray both situations. So on the one hand, I haven't shown in the game the mission trees. This is a feature which allows us to develop, let's say, 30, 40, 50 missions which have a strong narrative behind them. And this is more on the historical simulation. So in the case of Korea or China or Japan, probably we'll have missions about consolidating the state, different situations in Japan with the daimyos, with the shogun, in China about managing the different states, the different rebellions. We also have some missions about expansion, and we try to make, on the one hand, historical expansion, but also like this kind of historical expansion. So what if, let's say, China invaded and annexed Korea instead of having this type of relation, which was a bit different as a tributary, how we call it in the game, or it has other names in historiography. So we also try to develop sometimes these alt historical paths. So for instance, to all the countries that surround China, we have developed a game mechanic that allows them to take the mandate of heaven, which is the name we give to this mechanic, and which was actually becoming the emperor of China, and to Sinicize their cultures, pretty much as the Manchu invaders did in the Qing dynasty. So if you play as Korea, you play on a certain way, and you become the emperor of China by conquering a decent amount of land. At some point, you will be able of making the decision of mixing the Chinese culture with the Korean culture, a bit like the Manchu did in the Qing dynasty. So we try to have both paths open for the player to follow a more historical one and to follow a more alternative one.
Okay. Yeah, I think since you bring up the mandate of heaven mechanic, right? And I think this is relatively new, right? I think in the history of Europa Universalis, right? I mean, this is EU4, and then there were earlier iterations, and I think before it was pretty much something where if you're Ming or Qing, you start with being the emperor of China, and you really there isn't much flexibility, right? It follows a sort of predetermined path, and now it's opened up so that players who are on the edge of the Chinese empire can basically do what the Manchus, right, in the early modern period. And I think this, for me, raises an issue, maybe a technical issue, and this is maybe something that international relations scholars would be interested in as well, is this question of how do you simulate something like diversity, the diversity of diplomacy in the early modern world, right? I mean, this is not the 20th century where pretty much every nation state has, a foreign ministry or a State Department that sends diplomats, and there's sort of international law where everything is following, in theory, there are certain parameters that are shared globally. But in the early modern period, right, from I guess 1450, 1800, there are many different diplomatic systems, international systems with different rules. So I wonder about how do you approach that, right, in the game? Does the game try to capture that diversity, or does it try to sort of do something where that works across the world?
We try to make a mix. On the one hand, we need a base game mechanic for diplomacy, and it is modeled mostly on the European pre-Westphalian and post-Westphalian system, because it was the most not developed, but the most formal system was developed in Europe, with the embassies, diplomatics, very constant contacts between a lot of different countries. So this gives us a base game mechanic for the whole game. This is useful because the player does not need to know a lot of different diplomatic systems, but only one. So that makes the gameplay easier. But we try to increase the diversity of diplomacy by creating very different types of relationships between countries. So we will have some standard ones, again, because this is good for gameplay. But for instance, in the case of China, it was created along with this mechanic of the mandate of heaven, a type of relation between the Emperor of China and other countries, which was called tributaries. So it was related to these countries having this type of relation with the emperor, where there was some kind of yearly tribute to the emperor, which was not always done or by the countries. It depended on each country, its internal situation, the situation in China itself. So it was it varied over time, but it allows the player to have this feeling that the diplomacy in East Asia is different from the diplomacy in Europe, because it is centered around China, which is the behemoth in East Asia, which is something that is not happening in Europe. But let's say we also have a different relationship between the tribes or the nations in the Americas. So this is we also allow this with another action, which is the casus belli. Again, this is very European, but it works in the sense that we have created so much diversity that it allows us to cover these different types of aggressions between different types of countries, nations, states that are not covered with regular diplomacy. So again, a war between two different nations in the Americas or sub-Saharan Africa will probably have a different sense than in Europe or in East Asia. So we think that this has worked very well over the years, having a base core mechanics, and from that gaining in depth by portraying more diversity between the different regions, and also having some kind of evolution on time. Because, for instance, there is a mechanic for the revolution based on the French Revolution, which only appears in the last 100 years of the game. So the player also has this sense of the history is progressing or evolving, or let's say it's not the same the 15th century than the 18th century, because this terms of progress advance are a bit like 19th century, I know, but I think that you know what I mean.
Sorry, I muted myself. We have some questions from the audience. We have one from Richard Kim, who asks, it's evident that a lot of historical research goes into designing national ideas, events, missions, which are often collectively referred to as historical flavor. But when it comes to designing the core gameplay mechanics that serves as the game's foundation, such as trade flows being non-reversible, culture, religion being singular and discrete for a province, technological progress being mostly fueled by the ruler's innate abilities, how much does historical research matter? Does historical research lead game design philosophy or vice versa? Or is there another better way to think about this? That's not in this binary framework. And I think I'll just add on to this issue, right? Is this question of historical research and feedback? You know, how does the game change, right? Because of your historical research, right? How does that feedback work? Okay.
Yes. So again, it depends. So there are some game mechanics, game systems, game features that are more game design led, because it's important for us to make them work. So let's say warfare is something that is very game design led. Obviously, we try to put as much history in that. So we have different types of historical units. The military units are different between the different regions, between the different periods. So there is, it's not the same to fight wars in the 15th century in Europe than to fight wars in the 17th century between an Asian and African country, because one of the factors are this type of different units. But for other features, they are more history based. So for instance, we have this mission system, which is mostly based on that country's or that region's history. And in this case, it will be the historical research that could lead to this game feature, because the historical research, what we call the design or the game design of this feature, allows us to later develop the gameplay, and not the case. So again, if let's say you start as a Jurchen tribe, so there is a narrative about consolidating the Jurchen tribes, then going into forming a unified Manchu state, then going into China, the first campaigns against the late Ming dynasty. We have, for instance, Nurhaci, the Manchu leader, portrayed. So in this case, it is history that drives the gameplay of this feature. Apart from that, obviously there will be features that are in between. So for instance, religions, we try to portray as much different religions as possible. And if the religions with different mechanics at the game release in 2013, which much fewer than the religions we have with their own set of mechanics in 2023. So we have been developing them. Obviously, some will have a more polished design. Let's also put this way, it's not so easy to portray some religions than other, because for instance, Confucianism is a hard nut, because well, Confucianism is a religion. That's a first philosophical question, if it's more a philosophy than a religion, but it works in our game narrative as a religion. So how do you portray Confucianism, the scholars? Sometimes it's not so easy in that sense. Or let's say something that also what has got a couple of reworks has been Shintoism. So the last rework, its narrative was about isolationism or opening the country, which I think that in that case works well as an historical narrative, but also from a gameplay perspective, because it offers the player to go the Tokugawa way and make Japan isolate or mostly isolate from the world, but the player also has the agency to open Japan to the world and maybe again go trading, colonizing, or maybe not colonizing, but just making money by trading. So just it's a mix. It depends of feature, situation, etc.
So I think just responding to this point, and this is sort of one thing that I thought about just hearing your response, is that from a sort of more academic perspective, we can actually think of each of the game mechanics as a particular theory of history, right? There's actually a historical argument being made, right? Because if you, for example, say Shinto, if you have a mechanic called Shinto, and then that's how you open up the Tokugawa, or open up Japan or close off Japan, then there's actually an embedded historical argument. From academics' perspective, the game is making an argument that the religion Shinto is directly related to sort of diplomatic policy in Tokugawa, right? And then if hypothetically, I mean, of course, this is not in the peer-reviewed research journal or something like that. But then the argument against that would be to say, well, if you look at the recent research, many scholars argue that there's no link between the two, right? So I guess to continue the question that Richard asked is, if, for example, you have a mechanic that works well on a game playing level, and then let's say a fan or one of your team members discovers that, well, there's actually research that says, we have this mechanic that says, I don't know, we can have a it's hard to talk about history without concrete examples, but let's say you have a society that says, if you use this religion, then you have bonuses for warfare. Okay, hypothetically. And then there's a research article that says, actually, in this society, that religion actually caused the military to fall apart instead, right? If you encounter that kind of research, what happens, right? If something like that happens, if that new research or new historical considerations.
Well, the good thing about historical research is that it never ends. So we are constantly revisiting more or less the same topics, because history is already past and it doesn't exist following some historiographical trends. But the historians, what we do is rewriting constantly the same facts, because we apply a different view or a different focus or a different method. So as historians, we know that history is not fixed, but history evolves as historians do. So it's the same for this game. So the the mechanics are constantly evolving, because this is also what 10 years of development of the game has allowed, that what worked in 2013 maybe does not work in 2023. So the game mechanics evolve. So a good example of that, and maybe this is something that we can talk later, is that in release there was a game mechanic called Westernization, which was tackling some countries, westernizing So Japan might be a good example, but a bit later or outside of our time frame with the Meiji Revolution. But this is more or less the spirit, and this is something that was a bit contested. That did not work perfectly fine. It also had this heavy European focus, so it was replaced by a different game mechanic called institutions. So on the one hand, this for gameplay perspective, there is a strong narrative about Europa going universalist. So the imperial, the colonizers' empires, the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, developing. So for gameplay, we have to kind of boost it a bit. But in this case, with institutions, it has allowed us to, so a lot of institutions are born in Europe. Let's say printing press, which is debatable, but well, this will be the topic for another seminar. But it has also some flexibility, because later institutions and player has agenda about developing these institutions in their country, and later institutions can spawn in different countries. So for instance, in the 1600s, we have an institution called the manufactories, global manufactories. So if your country is advanced enough, you can make it spawn, let's say in Korea or even in sub-Saharan Africa, because this is not settled. This is not hard blocked to Europe. So this is the type of mechanic that is a good example of how historical thinking has evolved in this video game over 10 years.
Yeah, I remember that Westernization mechanic, and now it's no longer present, right? It's sort of been taken apart. And what I find fascinating about that is that it actually matches the direction of historical scholarship on East Asia and Asia over the past 20, 30 years, where if you go 30 years back, all of it, Meiji Restoration, 19th century reforms in China, it's all done, a lot of the historiography talks about it in terms of Westernization, but now it's pretty much dropped out of any serious discussion of these issues for the reasons that you mentioned, right? The problems of Eurocentrism and the problem of putting all these different kinds of institutions under one big package, when many of them may have different origins in different parts of the world, and things and a lot of the sort of debates by historians like Andre Gunder Franke about world trade, Kenneth Pomeranz, Sixiang Wang here at UCLA about capitalism, has sort of, their work over the past 30 years has changed the conversation around that, and it's fascinating to see that reflected also in the game design. I guess on the issue of imperialism, I think we can maybe a sort of different question, and this has to do with the issue of position taking and having the player be an empire builder. What does it mean for the player to potentially take up the role of a colonizer or an imperialist, or and the ethics of that, right, from the player's perspective, and I think your colleagues probably building Hearts of Iron have probably more difficult questions with this, or Victoria, right, in the 19th century or World War II, but in the early modern world, historically, of course, there were genocides and massacres associated with colonialism, war, committed by various different groups of people, right? And the question is sort of, to what degree do these things play into the game? How does it, do these issues come up, right, when we think about simulation gameplay? And
so I think that this is related to the former topic, because I think that we can see that the game has evolved from Europa to Universalis. So what I mean with this is that I think that we have gone, let's say, from approach to history, let's say, as Needham on this problem with China and with Europe to something that is more akin to the global history of the last 10 years trend. So what does this mean in the game? The game has gone for more diversity. So not only each country in the world can be played, but each country has its different sets of mechanics, government, religion, that makes it a different experience. So a player can experience very different situations. So he can play as a colonizing power, let's say Britain, but it can also play as one of the colonized. So the player can play as an Indian state or African state, and let's say make the history different. This is one of the key points, that because of this set of different mechanics that we put in the hands of the player, it's up to the player to build history, to construct their own history, its own narrative. So what we allow the player is to develop this. So maybe in one gaming session, players playing as a ruthless conqueror, and maybe in other session the player is focusing on trade and being more focused on, let's say, coexistence with other countries, with other peoples. So I think that a key point is that we as Paradox Studios, as a company, we do not want to whitewash history, but we want to trade history more or less, as this is a simulation, but more or less as it was. Also from, in this case with this game, from the perspective of a ruler. So obviously a ruler is not a common folk. So obviously he's in the elite part of the equation. But this also poses historical problems to the player to think about if the player wants to think about it. So these problems with colonization, with empire building, with managing the society, the states of a society with different cultures, different religions. So a player can decide to suppress a religion or to try to develop policies more in line with coexisting religions in a country, or let's say with the colonization.
So we seem to have a bit of a connection issue. I'm just going to pause the recording for a second. Sorry, I had a connection issue. Yeah.
No problem.
So we may have missed a few seconds just earlier regarding you were talking about the rulers being having this players, by taking the position of a ruler, they
Yes. So the player is in the position of a ruler of the elites, but the player has agency and has the decision. So for instance, we have different policies for the native peoples that are around the world. So when colonization happens, the player can decide to have a coexistence policy with the natives, to have a trading policy with the natives, and to have a repression policy with the natives. And this one, the player can kind of genocide the natives on a certain province. So this is what I said with trying to portray history. I think it's good to give these different possibilities to the player and not having them fixed. Like if maybe there was some kind of genocide in the 16th century colonization, but maybe the player does not want to go that way. Obviously, if the player decides to go that way, the deaths are going to be portrayed in the screen. And in a war, on a battle, in a war, he's going to watch soldiers dying.
Let me just before we hit 2 o'clock, I want to give our audience, there are several questions from the audience that I want, that I hope we can address. And there's a question from Sean Han, and I think this touches back on this question of the sandbox and player choices, and to what degree the players, how they choose what kind of history they want to witness when taking, when playing the simulation. Sean says, thank you for giving us this fascinating opportunity to think about history in gaming. Here is my question. How does historical games, and I think this is not just for EU4, but broadly speaking, reflect the historical subfield beyond political, economic, or international history? For example, would it be possible to play the game exploring different vectors, such as religious history, gender history, environmental history, or subaltern history?
So this is not so easy, because the core of the game is geopolitics, because it's a grand strategy game. So it's going to be, and it's very focused about politics, economy, international relations. So those fields are going to be the core of our game. With the years, it is true that we've been trying to portray more diversity into the game. So let's say, for instance, on gender history, we have a few years ago an expansion called Women in History. So in that expansion, the game was portraying women that ruled different countries, and we have very good examples: Isabella of Castile, Elizabeth of England, Catherine the Great of Russia. So it was more about giving more diversity in that field. This also poses other challenges, because, for instance, we are talking about all these women being rulers, so they are also elites. So let's say we have this type of conflict between what will be gender history, but also subaltern history. So this is very interesting, because there are a lot of conflicts in that sense between different historiographical schools or types of studies, which we try to balance, and it's not always easy. Let's say on subaltern history, it's also not easy. Something that we have states as social classes, but it is true that probably a bit more effort could have been put into this, because let's say in India we have different type of states, but we don't have the lower caste portrayed. This is not saying that we do not have this type of subalterns not portrayed. We have peasants in the game. We have a lot of peasant rebellions, different groups of different religions, cultures can revolt against the player. This is portrayed with having very, very different types of rebels that are going to rise up against your rule, and that have their own demands and their own agenda. So they kind of fit into this field. We also have some divergent types of governments on this side. So, for instance, there is some type of peasant republic government, which is something more akin to a horizontal peasant village type of council, which in this case has overtaken an entire country. So we also try to, and obviously this was not common or very common in our time frame, but we try to portray this type of governments. We also have let's say, this type of tribal governments that are also more horizontal. So let's say step by step, the perspective of the game has become wider with years. And even if we have this focus on the traditional fields of history, because it's the core of the game, but these new views on historiography are also progressively being incorporated into the game.
Okay, I think what we'll do is take one last question, and then I think this is from Sixiang Wang, who asks, there has been a lot of discussion about balancing historical accuracy, nuance versus game balance. Do you see historical entities and institutions as an inspiration that helps you develop a variety of engaging and well-balanced game mechanics? Or do you see them as more of a player engagement strategy that tends to hurt game balance, but you try hard to incorporate them into the game?
I absolutely think that the first one is the direction that we want. We think that these entities or institutions or social groups or which are historical apports, they give a lot of engaging content to our game. The other part of us as game developers is balancing that content. So obviously from game design, we should not try to hammer content into a game, like putting it because of putting it, implementing it just because reasons, but trying to make a smart implementation of that content. And this is good because it's going to be more rewarding for us as developers. It's going to be better for the balance of the game. And I think that this is also something that the community of players value very much. That when we have a type of design that fits both historicity and gameplay, that's kind of perfect for everybody. Because yeah, that's very interesting. And building a bit on that for 2 or 3 minutes, if you don't mind. Also because there was another question that was interesting by Nicolas Marceau. So he asked about how do we perform this research in teams. So we have different teams in this type of studio. Different disciplines. So we have programming, we have art, we have game design, content design in the case of Tinto. So it is usually performed by the game design departments or content design departments, the historical research. And then obviously depends a lot on the different type of people that works in different departments. But usually it's, if an artist have this type of interest for a certain historical feature or entity, or if a programmer also has this interest, this makes things easier and more interesting because we try to have more or less most of the people on the same loop. So obviously we are by the game developers, so there's a high focus on let's say gameplay and making a fun game, which I'm sorry to say in a historical seminar, but making the game fun is the core of the game, because obviously if the game is not fun to be played, you are not going to have a community. So we wouldn't be talking about this type of issues because nobody will be playing the game. Right. But if we achieve this, making the game fun, obviously, if in this case of our games, if they are also historical and we make these historical features to work well with the gameplay, as I said, it's perfect. It's perfect. Everybody is going to be happy, both us the developers and both the players.
All right. so that was in response to Nicholas Marceau's question about how the process of historical research is performed at your company and how it works together with the game design teams. I guess Álvaro, thank you so much for joining us today and for having such a enriching conversation. And it's eye-opening for me to hear about sort of how the studio engages with game design and gameplay and through sort of a historical research and also thinking about modeling history, right? And I think this is another issue, I think, that goes beyond necessarily just historiography and narrative, but also, now I'm sure in the humanities especially, there's a lot of talk about digital humanities, simulation, modeling, and in a sense, gameplay, right? Having a game incorporates all these data layers and complicated sort of abstract ideas into sort of a layer that a computer system can process and interact with. So there are all these layers, right? That goes down all the way down from numerical data to cartography to sort of how do you model systems, right? And I think from thinking from that way, the act of creating the game is in itself a kind of interdisciplinary exercise, requiring tools from all sorts of different directions. And I know I said we had one that was just one last question, but I think maybe we should just talk a little bit about this. Is sort of, I assume some of us who are tuned in and also who will later watch this on YouTube or who are currently watching on YouTube are maybe interested, are fans of history or people trained in historiography and are interested in sort of taking their careers to a direction outside of the academy or working in the creative industry with their historical knowledge. And I'm just wondering if you have any advice or thoughts about this move, this transition, this this journey, since you're somebody who has made it yourself, right?
Yes, it's a difficult question because if you will have asked me 5 years ago, I wouldn't have bet that I would be working in video game industry. So, life was this way. For someone interested in this type of career, I think that probably the most important thing is passion. So what I mean with this, if you are passionate about history, as if you are passionate about video games, first you are probably going to be someone that likes writing about history, which is a core skill. In this case, we are, as content designers, we are also narrative designers, let's say, and narrative is everything for a historian, right? Also, I think that apart from this passion, obviously having some passion on video games is not going to hurt, but it's going to help a lot getting this place of following this career in the industry. I mean, for me, in my case, it was applying to this job, and I got in because of my academic skills, but also because of our background, but also because of my knowledge of the game. So I think that these are the two main features. There are more people in Paradox's company, in other studios, or we are 2 historians in Paradox Tinto, and there are more historians working in other Paradox games. So I think that this is something that can be followed by historians on the making. If they put this effort and they know what they want. I think that this is also important because there are very different ways of getting into the industry. There are different ways of progressing in the industry. So just if some of the people that are hearing to us have this passion, I will encourage them to try to follow it and develop this type of skills.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, it's now 2 o'clock, and I think maybe it's time for us to close out the meeting. And thank everybody for coming and for listening to our conversation today. So thank you, Dr. Sanz, for taking your time to share with us your work and also your thoughts on games in history.
Thanks to you, Dr. Wang, for the invitation and also for allowing me to share a chunk of my job with you and the people watching us with this academic background as students or whatever they are doing right now in academia. Because as a former academic historian, it's also good to have this type of encounters. I think so.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.